welcome everyone. Karen and I are delighted to be here with you today to talk about strategy execution and specifically to focus on what we found to be a key missing link in companies' efforts to successfully execute their strategies. As almost any CEO and many academics will tell you, competitive advantage is fleeting in today's market, and at least for Roland Pan, Director of Strategy at Skype, he believes that execution may be one of the only remaining sources of competitive advantage in a fast-moving and transparent world. Furthermore, competitive dynamics in many of your markets today require a one-company strategic approach, and that often requires the execution of strategy in a matrix or a cross-silo organizational structure, which is no easy feat, as you know. We're going to focus today on a simple approach that in our experience has shown can dramatically improve an organization's ability to execute on its strategic objectives. More specifically, we're today going to teach you about a model to improve the effectiveness of strategy execution, help you understand how other companies can put that approach into action and look at the underlying skills that are required, give you some insight into some ways you can apply that model and those skills in your organization. And we've taken a very practical approach to this webinar and are going to give you some tools to take away that we hope will help you moving forward back into your workplace. Briefly, just a moment about Insight Experience. We develop dynamic business simulations that combine the hard and soft of leadership to connect leadership to business results. We're about group-based learning experiences. We work at all levels of management, from first level to executive, globally with Fortune 50 to 500 and out to Fortune 1000 clients, and have been doing this for a long time. Our focus is primarily in the simulation learning methodology. From a content perspective, we focus on 4 core leadership challenges, including executing strategy, which is our focus for today. We're going to drill down into an area of strategy execution, which I'll get to in a moment. Our experience with strategy execution really comes through 2 lenses. Some of it is research-based, but primarily it's having worked with hundreds of organizations over the last couple of decades to help their leaders develop their strategy execution skills and become better leaders. We also, because of our simulation methodology and the way we teach and transfer skills to our organizations, have seen thousands of teams, tens of thousands of participants over the years actually executing strategy in real time in simulation environments. And that gives us a really unique perspective to watch how strategy is translated and implemented in our simulation-based organizations. So what's the problem we're trying to solve here? Let's step back a bit. The problem with strategy execution, frankly, is that we're just not very good at it. Most organizations, you can see a broad range of data here from some credible sources. Most organizations don't fail in the formulation of the strategy, but rather in the execution of it. Whether it's as poor as 10%, as Harvard Business Review says, or maybe as good as 30%, it still says the failure point is not the creation of the strategy, but its execution and implementation in day-to-day work. If you dig a little deeper underneath this, you can see some interesting numbers here. Only 27% of an organization's employees have access to its strategic plan. Only a little over a quarter. Most organizations don't even have a consistent way to describe their strategy rather than putting it in a big binder and letting it sit on a shelf. More than half of typical organizations don't actually link their strategic priorities to their budget. They don't put their money where their mouth is. That makes it pretty challenging to execute if you're not funding behind your priorities. And according to Harvard Business Review, only 8% of organizations actually even report out on or track lead performance indicators, which would connect the strategy to where the strategy is being implemented out in the businesses. So the bad news is those are pretty awful numbers. The good news is there's low-hanging fruit here. And we believe with a simple approach and a little time and attention on leadership's part, you can vastly improve the quality of your execution. So what's up underneath execution itself, and where are things breaking down? Based on our research with clients, our work and implementation in the field, we believe the critical missing link is translation, the first step in a good execution process, which has three components. Do you understand the strategy? Can you connect the strategy to the work of your people and what they do every day? And then can you align them to the corporate strategy, to the work they need to do, and to the work that they need to do with others, the work of others across the organization wherever they sit? This three-step process of understanding, connecting to the work of your people, and aligning your people's hearts and minds to the task are the critical elements to successful translation. We're going to drill into each one of these, but before we do, probably a good time to step back to a real client situation. And to do that, I'm going to turn things over to Karen. Karen?
Great. Well, thank you, Nick. We'd like to share a story with you today about a woman who participated in one of our sessions. She's a director at a communications and entertainment company, and she learned our strategy translation tools during the session and was soon put to the test in a real work challenge. Let's first consider what was happening in the business environment that triggered her challenge. Like many companies in her industry, hers was encountering a highly competitive marketplace, cost pressure from content providers, and customers who resist price increases to help cover those content costs. The strategic direction, therefore, that was given from senior leaders was to reduce costs in the business by centralizing many functions and operations. And as a result, she was asked to close a call center in her region, which is a difficult decision to inherit. Like many leaders at her level, she inherited the strategic decision and was in the translator role to help the impacted employees through the transition. She reported back to us these events that she used the strategic translation tools and saw a very positive impact from doing so. Let's go ahead and take a look at what she did. And before she communicated the news of the closing, this director really pushed for understanding the why behind the decision. And to do that, she needed to proactively seek external data as well as engage senior leaders to give her the information she needed. This is an important step because many times leaders who are not actively making the decisions, they only work with the information that they're given rather than push for what they actually need. She then started the process of deciding how she was going to frame the situation. So what perspective was she going to give others about the strategic direction? And also broke it down into manageable milestones for her team. And she looked at the company strategy and made sure that she could connect the dots between what her people do and what the organization was trying to achieve. And lastly, she was able to align the team to the decision, not only because she was armed with the work she did to understand and connect to the strategy, but also because she communicated that information clearly and consistently. And we collect feedback from former participants of our sessions, and we know that this approach to strategy translation has an impact on their ability to execute. And let's go ahead and take a look at several of the impacts that people realize from their work in strategy translation that they've communicated to us. If we consider the director that we were just discussing, she found the employees who were most impacted by the center closing were actually the more bought in and committed employees to the decision compared to those who weren't impacted. And that's interesting because typically in a situation like this, the impacted employees would be more frustrated than the others. She attributes that to her use of the strategic translation tools that we just described. And also her ability to use data and perspectives she gathered during the understand phase increased trust and created more open and candid conversations in the process. Now, to do this, you're probably thinking, well, what skills would I need to develop in order to be able to move through these steps successfully? And essentially, there are two sets of interdependent leadership skills. As you work through the steps of understand, connect, and align, you use a mix of cognitive skills and interpersonal skills. The cognitive skills we use include business acumen, our knowledge of finance and strategy, the ability to find and analyze data, and we also use interpersonal skills like communication across the organization, empathy for the needs of our stakeholders, and our ability to hold people accountable to achieve strategic objectives. And we're going to each of these steps, and we'll highlight for you the cognitive and interpersonal skills that help you to navigate through each one. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nick now to set up the first step, which is to understand.
Thanks, Karen. That's great. So the first step in any language that you're trying to translate, of course, is to understand. You can't speak it until you understand it, and understanding is precedes any form of application and connection. So we're going to focus on that, and understanding is largely, in many ways, a cognitive task. In other words, you really got to put your analytical hat on as a middle manager to understand the complexities of corporate strategy and in some cases of business strategy. And yet you also have to have your interpersonal hat on because you have to be able to ask good questions. You have to be able to engage in thoughtful dialogue. In some cases, have a courageous conversation or a robust dialogue with an executive to push back if you don't understand the strategy or if you can't make the connection to what you're doing or your people are doing. So you need to do both effectively. And if you look at it at the next level of detail, it's important to distinguish sometimes between the what and the why. We often get confused between strategy as mission, vision, values versus strategy as what business should we be in and what's our competitive advantage and scope. In fact, you need to be able to think both ways about strategy, but especially you need to recognize that strategy, in fact, occurs at different levels in an organization. And it occurs in different ways, so that if you're sitting in the middle of an organization, you really benefit from understanding, from knowing what part of the strategy do you need to simply understand, where do you provide input, and what parts of the strategy are you actually determining in and of by yourself or with others where you sit in the organization. In order to do that, and make some of those distinctions. Karen's going to talk about some distinctions in a moment, but a concise set of questions is really a useful tool for leaders to understand strategy. We're going to jump to that in just a moment. And we've talked a bit about the cognitive and the interpersonal already. So how is our understanding? How do we do at understanding strategy overall in organizations? Let's look at a little data. And this is a little bit of a competition, perhaps, by the numbers. Let's start at the top, which is, according to John Cotter and his organization, 7 out of 10 employees are unknowingly misaligned with their direction of their companies. So they don't get it, and they don't know they don't get it. Only 30% of the people even know whether they are aligned. And then worse than that, perhaps 14% chat.org of employees understand their company's strategic direction. We're not done yet. Fortune magazine says only 10% of employees understand their company's strategy, and not to be beaten by anyone, of course, Harvard Business Review says only 5% of employees understand their organization's strategy. By any mark, that's a pretty miserable accounting for understanding. So I don't know how you can expect to succeed at execution if only 5% of your employees even understand the strategy. So let's turn it over to you for a moment, because let's get some real data to work with, and start with our first poll, which I'm going to ask Andrew for his help in setting up here, which is, If I ask 10 people in your organization at the coffee shop, at Starbucks, at the company picnic, to tell me what the strategy is, how many different responses would I hear from your organization? Would I hear none? Would everybody be completely aligned? A handful? 4 to 6, or 7 or more? So the data is rolling in here. Very interesting. We have some of you who feel that you're just a couple of different strategies. Oh, so 1 to 3 different answers I'm hearing. We're going to let this just settle out for a moment. Some with a lot of rocking and rolling here. This is interesting, isn't it, Karen? I know you have done a lot of this work in your own client organizations, and it's moving a lot. But let me transition it over to Karen as this data settles out. Observations about what's behind this.
Right. So it looks like about 97% of respondents are saying that it would be one or more. And that is not surprising to us, because when we ask this question of managers, we find that some people respond with the company vision, while others will talk about a value proposition, and still others talk about more technical decisions. And the truth is, they are all right. There are different levels of strategy in an organization, and that's why you get different responses. We find that a lot of leaders, particularly those from the director to the frontline level, are intimidated by the idea of needing to be strategic. And that sounds like a mystical responsibility to them, and they're not clear about what it looks like for them personally. So the first step to understanding strategy is knowing that there are different levels of strategy, and that very few leaders have responsibility for making decisions at all of these. The terminology we're going to use, by the way, is in no way the only way to describe these levels. The important takeaway for you is that the levels exist, and you have a unique role in each of them. So let's start by looking at corporate strategy. These are the highest level strategy decisions that leaders make in an organization, such as whether or not to be in or out of a certain business or a certain market. We can use Sony's recent decision to exit the PC market as an example. In corporate decisions, there are typically two pieces. There's gathering input, the actual making of the bet. And most leaders in an organization realize that they may be called upon to give input here, but the actual bet is made by very few people at the top of the organization. So for that reason, most of us are in the position of needing to stay informed about the what and the why of corporate strategy, but we don't actually make these decisions. Now, for business strategy, a company has decided what business they're in, and they now need to consider what will make them different. How will they compete? Why would a customer choose them in that market over another option? And great examples of business strategies are FedEx's operational excellence, Apple's product leadership, and Nordstrom's customer service. Again, leaders should consider whether they are giving input here or actually making these decisions. The last level is operating strategy. These are the choices we make every day about how to deliver against the business and corporate strategies. And most leaders in an organization are focused here, deciding how to spend that incremental dollar in a way that's aligned to the business and corporate direction. So as an example, how would a middle manager at Motel 6 versus Ritz-Carlton spend $1,000? The manager at Motel 6 would likely spend it in ways that would increase efficiency and reduce cost, whereas the Ritz-Carlton manager would spend it on something that would be consistent with the luxury experience that their clients expect. Now, we talk about these different levels of strategy as a first step to understanding strategy, because it really helps leaders to visualize where they focus. It demystifies that leading strategically piece for them. Where are they simply trying to get information versus where do they give input? And most importantly, where do they actually make decisions? And then with this clarity, people are ready for the next step to understand strategy. And we find that a concise set of questions will help. And we'd like to share this tool with you that we use to help leaders understand strategy. And it's a concise set of questions that guide you through the process of gathering information, data, and perspectives. So the tool starts at the corporate strategy level, and then it includes a subset of drill-down questions for each section. As you work through these, you'll then answer questions about business strategy and finally operating strategy. And Nick spoke about our two lenses earlier, and we use this tool in both of those ways for leaders to understand the strategy in their organizations and also to help simulation teams understand the strategy in their exercise before they make other business decisions. And in both scenarios, people have used this tool, find it really highlights for them their own specific information gaps and therefore where they need to focus their attention and conversations. They feel more confident going to senior leadership or searching for market data, focused issues rather than general strategic questions. And as we'll share with you, this tool is useful in all three steps of strategy translation. It's important as you work through these that you really peel back the data from the assumptions. You may need to use the interpersonal skills of questioning and leading upward to really understand the answers to these questions. Multiple people making assumptions find that they answer these questions in really different ways. So where do you go for the answers to these questions so that you can develop a strong understanding of strategy? Well, here on this slide, we're sharing with you some context areas that you really need to track. We encourage leaders to really think about broadening your information sources to be better able to answer the questions on the previous slide. Many of us have to admit we have some go-to information sources and perspectives from certain people that we use again and again. And you might need to be proactive in getting this information if it's not being communicated to you. A lot of understanding the strategy is using your cognitive skills. So you need to step back before you step in. And so the first part of execution is stepping back, not just jumping in to solve the problem. And most important is that your understanding helps you to make the connection between the company strategies and goals and your team's work. So I'm going to transition back over to Nick, who's the second step in our process, which is connect.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So Karen's taken you through a little bit of understanding. You've done the hard work. You've done the cognitive work. You've worked with your senior managers to really get some traction around the strategy of the business and what it means to you, where you sit. And now comes the most important step, we believe, in this process, the one that's most often missed, which is to really connect the strategy to the work of your people. And this, we believe, is where companies really tend to fall down the most because it's hard work. It involves a pretty much equal mix of cognitive skills and interpersonal and behavioral skills because you're connecting it through thinking, but you're working with your team also to make the connections and help them understand how it impacts their work. And if you haven't gotten to the level of granularity so that they know what decisions they're going to make that are different on a day-to-day basis, you probably haven't connected it clearly enough. If you drill down a level into this, into this connection, we are going to focus now in particular on two subsets of connecting to the strategy. One is how you frame the team's role in achieving their objectives. So this concept of frame, which is a bit conceptual, and we're going to start with that. And then also a much more kind of breaking it down specifically into a set of activities and initiatives that can be attached to budgets and timelines and KPIs and accountability that are sort of the bread and butter of execution. But you've got to first start with an understanding of how the team's work needs to be framed differently so that they can understand how it connects to what they're doing. So let's start with a fun exercise. I'll turn it over to you, Karen.
Okay, great. So we are going to put up an image here on the screen, and we are curious to hear from you about what you think you're seeing in that image. So go ahead and enter your response, and we'll see the range of responses that people believe they are looking at. A UFO, okay. That's great. I heard that one before, but that's creative. Yeah, shark mouth. That's interesting. I've heard lots of dental examples. A stain, dental X-ray. Yep, I've heard that one before for sure. A mouth. Okay, great. Well, we won't leave you in suspense any longer. We'll go ahead and show you what you are looking at, and that image was a piece of this large picture, and I did see at least one butterfly wing in those responses. So congratulations if you were able to identify it. This exercise is just a fun metaphor to lead into our discussion about Connect, because we'll be talking about the leader's role in defining and communicating their perspective of the strategy and what it means for their team. Now, a tool that we're going to share with you to help with Connect is called framing. And to understand framing, I'd like you to visualize a picture frame or a window frame. And these frames create a boundary around what someone sees and also, importantly, what they don't see. So this is important for strategic translation because it helps you to develop a comprehensive message about the strategy and your team's work. Now, framing uses cognitive skills as we analyze the situation, use data, assumptions, and hypotheses to define the frame. And also, we use interpersonal skills when we engage others to view a situation through our lenses. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at a practical everyday example to help illustrate this concept. So here's an example of something that, let's say you saw this on the way to work today, this poor woman sitting on the hood of her car with the hood up, and your original frame would probably be that she needs to get her car fixed. But if I gave you additional data from the environment and I told you that this is the third time this month that she has been in this position, you might develop a new frame. She just needs a new car. This one is just not working for her. Now, the power in this exercise is first to write down your original frame and then to push yourself to develop at least two alternatives, because neuroscience has shown us that we typically tend to stick with our original frame for a pretty long time, even when the environment is sending us a number of signals to tell us that it's unreasonable to do so. So what this tool and exercise is to do is to create the practice and habit for you to create more alternatives so that you can have those more comprehensive messages. Now, one way to create alternatives is to narrow from your original frame. And so in this case, she would be narrowing to say she needs a new highly reliable car, say she needs to buy a new Toyota, or to broaden the frame, which is to say I just need a new way to commute to work. Now, one important outcome of frame is that it drives the action from the people you communicate it to. Take a look at the three different frames that we have up here on the slide and think about how different her next steps would be. To help people practice this, and it does require a lot of practice to get good at it, you can practice it in a learning environment to help people understand it. So I'll give you an example from one of our simulation exercises where teams are asked to frame their projects based upon its scope and target market. And then that decision triggers different impact from their team members, including the innovation ideas that they get, stated their people are, and the trade-offs that they make. We had a team approach us because they were quite frustrated by the limited ideas and therefore market opportunities that they got from their team. But then they realized they themselves set that conservative stage with the way they had framed the project, the way that they had communicated it. And so framing does have a lot of power, and that people will they will interpret messages from it, and they will also determine what their next steps are based on it. Now, here's how you can use this yourself. First of all, you would need to document your frame, your perspective, how you would define a current challenge or work issue, a strategic message you had received perhaps. And be careful that you include what's important, who's involved, who's impacted, and admit to your assumptions and your hypotheses and your biases that have helped to shape that frame. And then you want to develop at least 2 different alternatives. And I will give you a warning that this is a cognitive workout. People, when we use this in our sessions, people tell us that this actually makes their brain hurt because it is a different way of thinking. We like to frame up an issue and then focus on execution. But by developing those alternatives, we can be more thorough and comprehensive. So you'll need to give people some tips to help them develop those creative alternatives. Some different things that they can do is try to reframe what the issue is to begin with. Have them re-examine whether they're really focused on the right issue. There's a good industry example, Pepsi, where years ago they had invested a great deal in new individual bottle designs to compete with Coke, which had one of the only brands you could identify by feel at the time. And John Scully, when he came in as CEO, said, I think we may be looking at this issue in the wrong way. And so based on a consumer study, he triggered the development of the 2-liter bottle, not just another individual bottle. And so a very different impact by looking at an issue in a different way. Also encourage people to get perspectives from other people. And I typically encourage them to choose people in different functions or outside of their project team so that they're really getting fresh eyes, even people outside of the industry entirely. You can also introduce a number of different creative thinking exercises to help people come up with creative alternatives. One that we like to use is called Reverse Your Challenge. So ask people to think about, what if you were actually trying to do the opposite of what you're working on? We did this with a client who was having attendance problems in the workplace and asked them to brainstorm ways that they could actually make the attendance worse. And after they had some fun with that exercise, they stepped back and looked at the brainstormed responses and realized that they were actually doing some of those things. And so they shifted their frame from this is a problem with our people to this is a problem with ourselves. And of course, they had more control and influence over that and were able to really improve the attendance issue. We also, you can broaden and narrow the way that we did in the car example, and you can also look at different time horizons too. Now, honing these skills is important with practice, and so as people leave our sessions, we ask them to use these in their real work, and then we go back some weeks or months later and ask them for feedback on how well it impacted what they were trying to do. And we thought you'd be interested to see some examples of what participants have shared with us after they use the tools back at work. And you can see on the left-hand side of this table the objectives that they were trying to achieve. On the right is the impact that they saw after using the framing tool to help them with their objectives. Let's look at one of these as an example. So in the third row, you can see an example where someone was trying to drive revenue in their business through improved Nielsen ratings. And he used the framing tool and realized that as he developed his alternatives, he said it helped give him the insight that his original frame actually included too much scope and would have resulted in a lot of extra work and energy on the path to the same outcome. And so he really felt as though framing prevented scope creep, and his project had great business results. It resulted in a 10% boost in viewership for his organization. Now, another tool that we use as part of the Connect phase is, we're going to call it breaking it down for your team. This is actually an extension of the understanding that we saw in the last section. And this acts as a guide for you to connect your team's work to the corporate business and operating strategies. So you see here the 5 questions that we showed you earlier. And now here you can use these drill down questions to really help connect what your team does to what the overall organization is doing. And when you do this, you're using, again, your cognitive and your interpersonal skills. So from a cognitive perspective, it's highlighting gaps where you need to better connect your team's work. And some leaders have actually shared with us that it highlighted for them areas where they still need to even make decisions. So they couldn't even define anything to communicate for that particular question. The other way that you can use this from an interpersonal perspective is as an alignment tool. So complete it with your team, get their input, and it really helps to align the team around the responses after you recover from your initial shock at how many different responses to these questions were coming from your team. So with that, I'm going to transition it back over to Nick, who will talk to you about the third step in our process, which is align.
Great. Thank you, Karen, very much. So some interesting work in both connecting through through framing and through the breaking it down piece. And finally, it doesn't matter at the end of the road, the end of the line, whether if you understand the connected to the work of your people, but unless your people are on board and know what to do differently and want to do it differently, it's not going to happen. So the question is, first, do they really know what they have to do? Do they know what's going to make a difference in the business? And then are they going to bring them their full selves, their full engagement to the process to really making it happen? And to do that, there are two pieces we want to touch on. As a leader in the organization, you need to constantly communicate what's going on, because the alignment process and the translation process in general is not a one-stop shop, a one-time, one-and-done deal. It's an iterative process that requires constant refinement. As a communicator, as a leader in the business, you have to communicate what you've learned in the understand and connect phases, the what of the business and the why, and to help people understand how they connect to the business, their contribution, how do they make a difference, and why is it important that they act, behave, apply themselves differently in support of the strategy. You also, of course, the biggest challenge for most executives is they say, well, I've told them the strategy. I've communicated the strategy multiple times, and yet they are not hearing it. We've already looked at the data that suggests how good we are at the actual communication process based on the understanding, which is not very good. You have to have a feedback loop to confirm that messages have been heard in organizations, and that you confirm what people are actually taking away. And then finally, if you don't have that feedback loop in place, you don't know whether the strategy is actually going to work at the frontline level. You can't make the full connection unless you've gathered the work and the knowledge of your people in the process to test the execution at that granular level. And again, that's when we tend to fall down. Now, finally, the second set here is not so much about pure communication, it's about action. And recognize that communication is also action. So once you have communicated, you have to align what you're doing with what you're saying, with what you're doing, and with what the strategy is supposed to be telling you to do, and minimize the disconnects. You have to resolve the issues quickly and transparently to your organization to maintain trust, and you need to track progress. This is when you can get into the actual KPI, the milestones, the accountabilities. So it begins with communication and then flows into action. Well, let's look at how we do. Let's look at some outside data to see how do we tend to do with communication as a key skill in translation. And according to The Economist, again, not very well. It is both the most important to get right of all the skills, this communication from the top to the bottom, right to the front line, so specifically what they need to do differently. It's the most important to get right, and it's also our biggest challenge in most organizations. So it pretty much trumps everything else. That data is pretty clear, and then so you have to ask yourself, what do you do about it? Now, the first is to align your team. And as Karen said, this tool works really well at this level, which is not just doing the work yourself, but actually involving your people in the process of alignment by taking them through in a group session the actual connecting to the strategy work to say, what does it mean to me? What what do I need to do to support winning? What capabilities do we and I need to support? And what specific things do I need to do? If you do that and invest the time in it, you will build some alignment in your team. And this is not so much about talking to them. This is about dedicating the time to work with them. So it is a commitment of time in strategic activity, which we didn't show as a statistic, but it's also one that we don't tend to do very well with. We tend to spend very little time in this alignment and engagement process in organizations as a whole. So you got to do that alignment work, and once that hard work of alignment is done and you've heard your team and possibly pushed back up to senior management with disconnects to address those, then it's a process of continual reinforcement through communication, which the data is also clear you can't possibly, because it's an iterative process. One model that we found is really useful in approaching this, and one that has been applied in our simulation work continuously for the last 10 or 15 years, and is consistently mentioned as a useful tool applied in their real-world environment, is thinking about communication from a strategic perspective. What goes into it? What do you people want to hear? Well, they want to know, how is my work connected with the strategy? How do I support it? How do I make a difference? What is it? Does it matter what I do, and how does it matter? Second, is what I'm hearing from you and from senior management consistent? Is it consistent with the business objectives I'm being held accountable to? Is it consistent over time, or is it changing as in flavor of the month? And by the way, are you telling me the same thing you're telling Karen or others, or Andrew or others in our company? As I listen to the message of leadership and your people are listening to you, they're listening hard to the tone of the message and whether they're engaged and inspired by it, and whether they've been recognized for their efforts, and whether you as a leader understand where they sit in the organization and what it really feels like to be doing their job. Unless you connect with them at that spirit level, you're probably not going to get across. And finally, of course, they want to know what's expected of us. What am I really going to do? What are my goals? What am I going to be held accountable to? And this communication involves multiple stakeholders. Whether in our simulation environment or your real-world environment, the application of this model as you think about communication, which is not just writing and it's not just words, it's of course the alignment of all your actions and your beliefs with what you say with what you do. This builds trust in organizations, and as we model in our simulations, is a primary driver of business results. So hopefully this is a useful tool to take away, and it also, by the way, for participants that have used it, helps them recognize that it's not easy. Good communication is really challenging, and it actually takes time and thought. So we hope you can use that and find it as a good structure as you think about communicating strategy to your people. So to summarize, translation, we believe, is the missing link in execution, and execution is a huge business issue for us to solve today in today's business environment. These three components, understanding it, connecting it to the work of your people at a granular level so they know what they need to do differently, and then aligning them through engaging their hearts and minds through your leadership, and helping them understand how they fit into the bigger picture. Those three steps will really engage your people, step up your performance, and we believe will have a significant impact on your execution results. We have worked with thousands of mid-managers in some of the organizations where we've been doing execution work, and found that these three critical steps are time and again the ones that make a difference in their organizations as they drive results. We've tried to focus, Karen and I, on putting translation to work for you by giving you 3 or 4 tools and exercises and frameworks that we hope you'll find useful and that you'll apply back in your workplace. And with that, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to see if we have any questions from our group today.
Well, thank you so much, Nick and Karen. This has been a great look at at the concept of strategic communication, and I think that it's something that's essential to achieving success in business today. We have had a number of questions come in through the Q&A interface, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. But I would remind HCI members, if you have yet to submit your question, I encourage you to do so now. So I think one of the first questions we've gotten over the chat function are sort of hypothetical situations or problem solution setups. So one of the ones that I got was someone saying, in my organization we have a lot of issues with accountability. Which tool do you suggest I start with?
Great. Well, thanks, Andrew. I'm not surprised you got that question because we hear so much about accountability in our work with clients and also frustrated by it. I think the first important thing to think about with accountability is to frame it for yourself, because we first need to understand what are the sources of accountability for an individual or in a culture. And interestingly, a lot of times when leaders express their frustration to us about this, it's with a mindset that they cannot really inspire a sense of personal responsibility and accountability in others, that there's something innate to them that's really the primary driver. And so we typically brainstorm a number of different drivers of accountability, including compensation, other structural pieces, the culture in the organization, the actions of their peers, the actions of their leaders, and typically when people give input to what that list is, they sit back and they look at it and they admit that they have control over some of those things. They have influence over a lot of them, and then as they really focus on those pieces, their power to create accountability is much better. I would start with our alignment tool to build accountability, because it's really, when you think about breaking it down for your team, it's really the best one to get team input as part of the process. And when the team is part of the process, then they have created the environment for saying, here's what we want to be held accountable to, here's what we and yes, we are agreeing to this because we're part of that process. And so therefore, they can then be part of peer accountability, and then it's not just the leader being in that role.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. Another question comes in from Angela, and I think that this is kind of an interesting one. To sort of paraphrase her comments, it sounds like she's coming from a higher education background, and that basically the organization is very siloed, and there's not a lot of supportive connection in terms of communication between her and her direct supervisors and the executive team. So she's asking if there's any kind of tool that you might recommend in terms of sort of breaking down these walls of barriers to communication in a large institutional organization.
That's a great question, Andrew, and we do work with some organizations as we co-deliver and teach at executive education organizations, for example, like MIT. Although we're not involved in the internal dynamics of those organizations, and we don't consult to them. We work with them to work with their clients. I would say that higher educational organizations are a little bit of a different animal in that they operate to a different set of economics and often have their own unique set of politics and influence and internal power dynamics. But the tools are still appropriate here. I think particularly in those organizations, tools of influence are how to manage influence and manage stakeholders in that environment are become even more of an important focus, as they are in many of the matrixed and siloed organizations that we work with. So however you can get to the right players to build a common picture and clarify with them, and then push up a little bit into the strategy of the organization to connect that and make it clear that it's difficult to execute on the higher level strategy of the higher ed institution and make it tangible without making some of those connections. I think that there is often a gap between the higher level mission, which is often how it's framed rather than a strategy, and connect it down. So one of the things you might want to do is separate mission and vision and purpose from the actual strategy and basis for competition in the organization, because higher ed organizations have to compete increasingly with the changing demographics markets for talent and for customers, and recognize that you have to make the jump from mission, vision, and purpose into how they're going to compete, and then make that translation down to those in the organization that are running the operations. And I think that is a big gap. I wish I had more direct experience working with those organizations on that subject.
Yeah, and Angela, I've worked with 2 different universities, and I completely share your experience, and I'm sure what is your frustration with the siloed nature. My biggest success was in role modeling this behavior, and it was a slower process than it is in a for-profit organization. But in reaching across the aisle to other functions and departments and saying, I would like your input, I would like to understand and have empathy for what it is you need and how you're impacted by what I'm working on. And it's a slower process, but I think that the more that you can do that, you start to slowly shift the culture, and people will start to see that as more of an accepted norm.
Thank you so much, Karen and Nick. That's a great answer, and I'm sure Angela really appreciates that deep dive into that topic. We've got an interesting comment coming in via Twitter from Anne. And I think this relates to sort of our setup of this conversation. Anne tweets to us at HCI Webcast, if corporate strategy has so little impact, why do we continually persist in that it's essential to build one top down?
Oh, what a great question. I'll take a first cut at that. Touched a nerve with me on that one. So I believe we have many of us continue to carry a traditional view that unified direction needs to come from the top in organizations, and that someone needs to make a singular decision who ultimately has control and accountability over the majority of resources in an organization. And I think that is partly grounded in the notion that at somebody at the bigger picture level has the perspective to make that decision that other people in the organization don't. Their context that they are looking at is different from our context. I think it's also a challenging notion in that many people believe that it's a dated notion, that the real intelligence in organizations comes from customers in the front line, and there are organizations that you know of out there in the marketplace that have tried to turn that formula upside down. But at the end of the day, there still has to be someone who makes the call between who gets competing resources in an organization to position that organization's goods, services, products, whatever, to succeed in the marketplace. I'm not going to get on the soapbox and tell you that that's the right model moving forward, because I actually believe embedded in your question is some advocacy that a broader base of input into corporate strategy from organizations would be helpful, and I would submit to you that it would probably also help speed of execution if you could do that. I'm interested if others have comments or want to pick up on that, and I'd sure love to have a follow-on conversation, but I know we only have a couple of minutes left.
Absolutely, Nick, and I think you're right on track there. I think that embedded within that question are some of those concepts. So we've got time for one last question, and this one comes in from Carla. And Carla's comment and question is this: I have a hunch that mid-level leaders cannot clearly answer the questions within the understanding strategy framework. Do you have any sense of how prevalent this might be in other companies?
Absolutely, Carla. I think that is very prevalent. And interestingly, though, I think that they can answer some of those questions from their perspective. And so that's where they need to use both their cognitive skills of looking for data and thinking about what the answers to those questions are, and their interpersonal skills of leading upward. The further down we get in an organization, there tends to be a buildup of frustration, of course, and more and more of a feeling of less control over the decisions that were made that was kind of inherited. However, we kind of look at what we control versus what we influence. And I think we need to focus on that influence piece by really pushing for responses from the director level and above in the organization, and pounding the pavement, if you will, more often to say, I need answers to this. I cannot direct my team in the right direction and get alignment from them if I don't really understand this. And part of the reason why they're not getting as much of the communication is even at that director level, there may not be as much understanding. And so more candid and open communication. The other advice I would give to folks who feel like they're not getting the answers and they're trying hard to get them is to be really candid with their people that they're translating to say, I don't know the answer to this, because that will build a lot of trust, and they can brainstorm together what are the best ways for us to feel like we are aligned with the larger corporate direction if we're not getting some of the answers that we need.
Thanks, Karen. I just wanted to jump in for a second on this because this really is at the core of execution challenges for business, and it was that problem statement that you just mentioned that drove, Carla, a huge initiative that a financial services client engaged us in several years ago and is ongoing. It's precisely because of that gap that things tend to fall apart. So using the assessment framework, as Karen says, as a tool to force you to learn better what's going on is actually doing the work of improving your translation and execution ability. We don't expect people to be able to answer all those questions out of the box. If they could, we probably wouldn't have the translation and execution challenges that we do. It's precisely because those muscles are lacking, and maybe some of the ability to have the conversations, as Karen said, is lacking, that we struggle. So it's a great question, and it's the right place to focus, because as people learn, they'll get better and improve their performance.
Well, I'm afraid that we have run out of time on this topic, but I would like to remind everyone that we will be recording a podcast with Nick and Karen, and we'll be able to kind of touch on some of these topics that may not have been addressed and make a nice conversation packaged around those ideas. So be on the lookout for that coming on hci.org soon. But I would like to extend a thank you to our guests, Nick and Karen, and of course to Insight Experience for making this webcast possible. But I would be remiss if I didn't extend the biggest thank you of all to each and every one of our HCI members. We appreciate your taking the time out of the day today to spend with us, and we look forward to seeing you on another webcast soon. Enjoy the remainder of your day, everyone. Thanks again.